Hi, Bob from Pinegrow here. In this tutorial, we will be looking at how to effectively use the Pinegrow Web Editor style panel to add pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements to your page elements. Along the way, we will also review CSS specificity and rule order, also called the cascade. Finally, we will look at how to easily rearrange the order of your styling rules in Pinegrow to get just the look you need. Let's get started. To start, let's quickly review specificity and the CSS cascade. Then we'll dive into what pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements are. If you feel comfortable with this topic, feel free to skip ahead to the next section of the tutorial. Both the cascade and specificity are used by the browser to determine what styling rules will be applied to an element. In our style sheet, the styling rules are made up of two blocks. The first is the selector. The second, surrounded by the curly braces, is the declaration block, and that's where our rules exist. The selector is used by the browser to determine what HTML is targeted by the styling rules in the declaration block. Pinegrow enables us to quickly put together the rules in our declaration block using the visual editor, but as I'll show you, it also helps us to create selectors. The browser calculates the specificity of a selector by assigning a value to each part to come up with a value with 4 positions. While this value looks like a 4-digit number, and generally can be read as 1, so 1000, 100, 10, or 1, each number is actually independent. Any single position can have a value greater than 9. In other words, having a number 12 in the third position doesn't result in an increase in the second position. For example, you could have a specificity value of 0, 0, 14, 0, but that would have a lower value than 0, 1, 0, 0. So where do these numbers come from? The first position comes from having inline styling on the element. For example, if you have a paragraph with a style attribute that says color red, this would have a value of 1, 0, 0, 0, or 1000. The only way that this could be overcome is by adding an exclamation point important declaration to your rule set. The second number comes from the number of ID matches between the selector and the element. For example, if you had a rule with a selector of #warning targeting an ID, that would have a value of 0, 1, 0, 0, or 100. The third position counts up the number of classes, attributes, or important for this tutorial, pseudo-classes. An example here would be if we had a rule selector of .warning targeting any element with a class of warning, that would have a value of 0, 0, 1, 0, or 10. The final position tallies both elements and, again important for this tutorial, pseudo-elements. So for example, if you had a rule that only had the selector P, it would apply those rules to all paragraphs and would have a value of 0, 0, 0, 1, or 1. So, as a very artificial example, let's add up this CSS selector. So we have an HTML consisting of a div with an ID of button group surrounding 2 buttons, one that only has a class of button text, and one that in addition to the class of button text also has an ID of search button. We only want to style the second button. So for CSS, we have #button group. This would target the div with the ID button group. And then within that, we want to target a button that has a #search button ID and also a class of button text and turn that color green. So let's look at the specificity. So first, we're targeting a button element. So that's in the 4th position, so we have a specificity of 0, 0, 0, 1. Then we want to add to that the targeting of a single class, .button-text. That's going to give us a specificity of 0, 0, 1, 0. And when we add them together, we get 0, 0, 1, 1. And then we want to add to that not only our targeting of the #button group of the outside div, but also the #search button ID of the inner button. So since we have 2 of those, our specificity is 0, 2 for the ID number, 0, 0. And when that's added to our former numbers, we now have a specificity of 0, 2, 1, 1. Again, this is a somewhat artificial example. In general, you want to keep your overall specificity high enough to target just the elements you want, but not so high that you can't overrule it if you find later that you want to change up part of your page design. So for example, for this particular targeting, really all that's needed is this ID here, search dash button, to give us enough specificity to only style this button and not style this button. So now we have a basic understanding of specificity. What about the cascade? In this case, coming in last wins. The browser loads and evaluates each style sheet and each rule on the style sheets sequentially. So a rule that comes later in the style sheet will overrule any previous rules that have the same specificity. Similarly, rules on the last style sheet to be loaded will override any with equal specificity on the first to be loaded. This can be a gotcha when combining and minimizing style sheets for production. Make sure to keep them in the same order. This also applies to adding styling to frameworks. You should always make sure that any custom styling is loaded after the framework styling to ensure predictable behavior. If you choose to have a style block on your page, for example in the head, it will be evaluated in the order it is encountered on the page. So if your style block is in the head after your custom style sheet is loaded, it will overrule any conflicting selectors with equivalent specificity. Okay, now that we've covered specificity and the cascade, let's talk about pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. Both are typically added to existing CSS selectors and impact the specificity as I outlined previously. A pseudo-class will add 1 to the class's position of specificity number, and pseudo-elements will add 1 to the element's position of the specificity. Pseudo-classes act on existing elements that possess a certain state. For example, when a form element is empty, that would have the state of empty. Pseudo-elements basically create new elements on the page. Let's look at a couple of examples. So one very common pseudo-class is hover. And this pseudo-class adds styling when the cursor is hovering over a particular element. As you can see from the first rule, pseudo-classes are prefixed with a single colon. So it's button colon hover. This rule would cause any button element on the page to have a blue background color when the mouse hovers over them, as long as other styling rules don't have greater specificity. For example, the second rule, button.nohover colon hover. The first selector would have a specificity of 0, 0, 1, 1, while the second would have a specificity of 0, 0, 2, 1 because of that extra added class. So therefore, any button with a class of no hover would add a transparent background when hovering. A good example or common example of a pseudo-element is the before pseudo-element. And as you can see, pseudo-elements are typically prefixed with 2 colons. The before pseudo-element allows you, for example, to add an icon or an image before an element on the page. This particular rule would add a font awesome checkmark before an element with the class icon span. While pseudo-elements are technically always prefixed with 2 colons, in about half the cases, a single colon can be used for compatibility with older browsers. Pinegrow has tools to allow you to construct styling rules with some of the most common pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements, and also tools to visualize how your page will look with those elements triggered. For this tutorial, I have chosen the Foundation 6.6 Framework realestate.html template. It has a number of elements that can be used to illustrate pseudo-classes and elements, plus the Foundation framework is relatively less opinionated than Bootstrap about pseudo-class styling, making the demonstration a little easier. Obviously, you can choose any page you want, but to follow along with the tutorial, create a new page by either clicking on the New Page or Project icon, here, or going to the File menu and selecting New Page. Next, select the Foundation 6.6 Framework from the column on the left. Then scroll down the page to the bottom and select the realestate.html template. Next, you want to save that to a new folder. So go to File, Save. Once you save the page in a new folder, Pinegrow should then ask you if you want to open the page as a project. You can click on Yes. Alternatively, if you don't get this modal, you can go to your project panel and then click on Open realestate.html as a project. This template has some useful elements. First, at the top, there's several navigation elements. Links are a very common element to receive pseudo-class styling. Next, there's a paragraph element. We can use this to illustrate what are called structural pseudo-class elements. Next, there are some buttons that would receive some of the same pseudo-classes as links, but are often the target of pseudo-element styling. And then finally, there's two form inputs that will be useful for looking at another pseudo-class. There are 5 pseudo-classes that are typically added to link elements: link, visited, focus, hover, and active. From the template, select the 3 navigation links clustered on the left side of the page, either in the page view or the tree panel. I'm going to select them in the tree panel. Link 1, then I'm going to hold down Command, link 2, and link 3. Note if you're using a PC, you'll have to hold down the Control key. Next, if it isn't already open, open your Style panel. In this case, we only want to style the links within our navigation, so we're going to give them a unique class. Add the class name into the text box. Make sure to prefix it with a period to indicate that it's a class. Pinegrow also gives us a little bit of information. Directly below our new class, Pinegrow indicates that the new rule set will be added to the style.css style sheet. If we were to click on this file name, we can change what the default style sheet is. Just below that, the target icon is colored orange. If we hover, it says the selected element will match the selector if the classes are added. If the class was already on the element, it'd be colored green. To the right of the colored icon of the target icon is a set of squares with a number. That number identifies how many other elements on the page will be targeted with the current selector. Currently, this number is 0 because no elements have our new class name until we hit the Create button. Finally, there's a checkbox to indicate whether or not we want to add the new class name to the selected elements. So let's add our rule and class name to the elements by clicking on the Create button. Let's give the text of the navigation buttons a black color using our new rule. Keeping the rule highlighted in blue, within the Visual Editor section of the Style panel, click on the T icon at the top. That will take you to the Font Text section. And then for color input, type #000 for black. Then hit Return. Okay, we now have some base minimal styling for our navigation link. Next, let's add the hover pseudo-class. There are a couple of ways that we can proceed. If we already have one or more of the navigation links selected, we can simply click on the ellipsis button, which is located here to the right of the Create button. If we don't have these elements selected, we can still click on the ellipsis button, but then click on the target icon in the header, located here, to select the elements that we want to target. In this case, the links are still selected, so we get a list of potential selectors for the element. They start at the very top of the page with the HTML, which surrounds everything, followed by the body, which selects all of our HTML code. Then we have a variety of other elements, this top bar div, which is located here in the tree, followed by a menu, followed by a list, followed by our links with the navlink class. We only want to apply hover styling to our 3 navigation links, so click on the navlink class at the end of the list. We can see it added to our selector. We can also see that our current selector will match 2 other elements, so it'll match all 3 of the link elements. If we had clicked only on the A preceding our new class, so let's get rid of this and click on the A, we can see that there are a total of 23 links on the page that would all get styled, indicating that we need greater specificity. If we go ahead and click on the nav link now, you can see it's added to that A link, and we are back down to only 3 elements being targeted. However, adding the A really isn't necessary. To add the pseudo class to our selector, we can now click on the colon that follows the class that we selected, and we will get a pop-down menu. And from this, we can pick the hover pseudo class. Note, our target icon has now gone dark. This is because we don't currently have a hover state on our navigation items, so the selector doesn't match. As long as the target icon was green prior to selecting the pseudo class, this is fine. Now, like with any other new rule, we click on the Create button. Next, let's go to the Visual Editor and add some background color and changes to the text color on hover. So with the new rule selected, we again go down to the font text section. And in this case, let's change the font color to a nice red, #900. And let's change the background color to a white. So we scroll down here to background and type #FFF. Okay, now if we go to the page, we can see when we hover over any of the navigation links, we get this change to red text with a white background. This is a simple example with only 2 styling changes, but what if we had something more complex? Having to keep going to the page view to hover over our element while making visual tweaks is a little painful, but Pinegrow has you covered. At the top of the style panel, there's 4 different pseudo-class buttons. These buttons simulate the state on any selected elements. They make changes in the page view and cause the rule set that's applicable to appear. So with our links selected, we can click on hover, and we can see that that final one that we were just over now changes to our hover style. If you were to go ahead and make changes now, you would see that those changes appear immediately without you having to go to the page view to hover. Note, if you were to now change to a different portion of the page, something else on the page, you can see that that hover state will still persist. And it will persist until you go back to the original element and unclick that pseudo class. As mentioned previously, there are multiple pseudo classes that can be added to link elements. It is important to think about what our desired styling outcome should be because an element can have more than one state. For example, a link can have been previously visited, giving it a pseudo state of :visited, but can then be hovered by the user. In that case, do we want the link to change style on hover? If so, we have to make sure that our hover rule comes after our visited rule. Remember, rules lower on the style sheet or later in the cascade override ones higher on the sheet. Next, let's quickly make rules for the visited, focus, and active pseudo-classes. For each, we will create the rule by clicking on the ellipsis button, then selecting the nav link class. Next, we'll click on the colon at the end to select the pseudo-class. We're going to add styling to each so they are distinguished from each other. Once we're finished with our changes, we can click on the 4 lines to the right of the style sheet. This will open up all of our rules. I'm going to collapse this down a little bit and open these up. So we have our original nav link with a color of black. So this would also correspond to if we were to have a link pseudo class added to the nav link, but it's really not necessary. We then have a nav link hover with a color and background color, a visited with a color and background color, an active, and then finally a focus. We can now test for the expected behavior by selecting one of our nav links in the page view or tree panel, and it's already selected here, and then clicking on the style panel pseudo state button for visited. Then we can try and hover over it with our mouse to see what happens. No good. This is because the order of the rule sets in the style CSS file. We can also see if we clicked on both the visited and hover pseudo-class buttons that the hover rules are crossed out in the active tab. So how can we change this? Open the Style CSS rule list again by clicking on the 4 horizontal lines next to the file name. And let's close down all of our different rule sets. Next, we're going to hover over the right side of each rule, and that'll cause a set of icons to appear. The rightmost icon with 6 dots acts as a handle. If we click and hold on this icon, we can move the rule set up and down the list to reorder it. While it's up to the designer to decide how styling should look, the link pseudo-classes are usually ordered link, visited, focus, hover, and active. For those Star Wars fans out there, we can use the mnemonic Lord Vader's former handle, Anakin. Okay, so let's put those in order. Remember I told you this original nav link is the same as having a pseudo state of link. Next up should be visited, so we'll move that up. Next should be focus, then hover, and then active. So now we can see that if we have the visited state on, we still get our hover effect. One last note before moving away from our link styling. To protect user privacy, most browsers limit the styling changes that can be made for the visited pseudo-class. From the Mozilla page, it says, note, for privacy reasons, browsers strictly limit the styles you can apply using the element selected by this pseudo-class. Only color, background color, border bottom color, border left color, border right color, border top color, outline color, column rule color, fill, and stroke. Okay, now that we've seen one example, let's just do a couple of others for practice. One great use of pseudo-class is for drop caps. Open the Style panel and click on the ellipse button. Then click on the target icon in the header. Select the paragraph at the left side of the page. And this paragraph element we can see already has a class name of subheader. We can choose this class name, then go ahead and click on our colon to add a pseudo-class. This time we're going to pick first letter. This, unsurprisingly, will target the very first letter of that paragraph with a class of subheader. Note, we can see that using the subheader class will result in an additional 6 elements being targeted. But for this particular example, we're going to be okay with that. Another alternative, if we need more specificity, would be to add a new class or ID to help our targeting. Another alternative would be to use something called pseudo-class chaining. In this case, since it is the first subheader element, we could use subheader, first of type, and then add onto that first letter. Pinegrow doesn't really support this natively, and that's because this can be a bit fragile and you can get some unexpected behavior. And really, you should only use this type of chaining when you can't alter the page HTML. Next, we need to add the styling to create the drop cap in the editor. So we create our rule. Then I'm going to bring this back up. So with this highlighted, we're going to go to text. We're again going to give it a nice red color. We're going to give it a left float. We'll give it a little bit of margin from the other characters. And then we'll change the font size to be a bit bigger. And then we'll also give an additional bit of line height to have it line up. Another useful pseudo-class for forms is the empty pseudo-class. This gives the user a better visual indication of any form elements that require an input. For this one, use the ellipse button. Click on the target and select that first form element. So again, since this is a simple page with just those 2 those two form inputs, we're just going to use the already existing input tag as our selector. Again, if you wanted more specificity, you'd want to add a additional class or an ID. So we're going to click on that. We're seeing that it's targeting both those form elements. Click on the pseudo-class and then go to empty. Create the rule. And now what we're going to do is for any of our form elements that are required and empty, we're just going to simply add a background color. We can choose pretty much whatever we want. I'm going to go with a background color that's partially transparent. And now what we can see is that since those are empty, they're colored. And as soon as we type anything into them, yes, it is a planet. Okay, for a final example, let's use a pseudo-element. This time we'll use the before pseudo-element to add a font awesome icon to our tour button. If we highlight the take a tour button on the left side of the page in either the page view or the tree panel, and then open the properties, open our properties panel, we can see that it doesn't have any specific selector to uniquely identify it. So in this case, let's go ahead and add an ID of tour button. Next, we're going to open the style panel, click on the ellipsis, and click our new ID as the selector. So right here, tour button. Go ahead and click on the colon at the end, and from the list, select before. Now create the rule set. Since we want to add a font awesome icon, we need to go to the File menu and select Manage Libraries and Plugins. From that, we want to activate the Font Awesome 4 resource. And in this case, it doesn't matter which of these we click, but we'll go ahead and click this one. Close that out. Close that out. Now with the tour button before rule selected, we scroll down to the font text section and just choose Font Awesome. For the last part, we need to manually add a new styling rule. So we're just going to hover here. That's going to allow us to add in a new rule. We're going to type content and then use one of the Unicodes for Font Awesome. And what you can see now is over on our button, we now have this icon before our button text. We can go ahead if we wanted to and add some margin just in our visual editor. Just go ahead and scroll for that. We'll just add a little bit of right margin just to make it look good. All right, so that's it. If we had wanted the icon to appear after the text, we could have used the after pseudo element. And as I outlined previously, most pseudo elements can be written with a single prefix colon for backwards compatibility. I think right now in the current CSS3 standard, there's a total of 8 pseudo elements, 4 of which can all be used with a single colon. And I encourage you to look on the Mozilla pages for a full list of both pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements, as well as which pseudo-elements can be used with a single colon. I've got links to those pages within the written tutorial that you can go back and look at. Hopefully this tutorial has demonstrated that adding these powerful CSS elements in Pinegrow and inspecting how they impact your design visually is fairly easy. And I hope this tutorial has helped to make Pinegrow workflow a little quicker and more enjoyable. So feel free to ask any questions or make comments in our forum or by email. And until the next time, have fun designing with Pinegrow.